Two well-known North African archery manuals contain an ambiguous description of an unusual method of arrow release allegedly employed by the medieval Slavs. It is said to involve locking some combination of the lower three fingers upon the string, while holding the index finger outstretched along the arrow and completely ignoring the thumb. This passage is bizarre in that it includes some important information, but it also omits vital details that are key to understanding how, and more importantly, why this draw may have been used. As a result, there has been much disagreement over the exact nature of the technique. In this video, I would like to offer my opinion and interpretation of the so-called Slavic draw. Although it was deemed strange by the Arab authors, who were more accustomed to the thumb draw, I believe this technique can be easily rationalized when examined from a native European archery perspective. In order to do that, we have to take into account traditional knowledge about three-finger draws, a good understanding of history, as well as more recent anthropological observations from other cultures. To begin with, it is important to recognize that the Slavic draw is essentially a mutated form of the so-called three-under release. Three-under was not terribly common prior to the late 20th century, but it was not unheard of, and it is sometimes a good choice when shooting shorter bows. The sharp angle of the bowstring tends to crush the fingers at full draw, so the more narrow profile of three-under is slightly less prone to this problem. Additionally, with the Mediterranean release, the index finger can become trapped between the arrow and the top half of the string, leading to abrasion on the finger and an awkward release. As three-under does not pinch the arrow, this problem is naturally obviated. However, there is a slightly more eccentric solution to these obstacles. It can be found in the Himalayan nation of Bhutan. Archery is Bhutan's national sport, and their archers typically shoot in a manner that is remarkably similar to the European method. Traditionally, the Bhutanese shot with bamboo longbows, but in recent years they have gained access to American-made compound bows, which feature very sharp string angles. As a result, some of these archers have wisely switched to three-under. But watch how they draw these modern bows when using the split-finger release. They begin drawing with all three fingers, but upon reaching full draw, and the index finger begins to be pinched against the top of the arrow, they unlock it from the string. Much like the Arabic description of the Slavic draw, the index finger is outstretched along the arrow, and the weight of the string is borne upon the other fingers. This Bhutanese technique is quite plainly an attempt to avoid discomfort when shooting with their short compound bows. It could also very well play a role in enabling them to get a sharp and clean loose, as the index finger would otherwise become trapped between the string and arrow, and be difficult to let go of in unison with the other fingers. I have tried this method myself with short Asiatic bows, and it really works. For the initial part of the draw, the fingers are able to ergonomically pull with the full power of the shoulder and back muscles. As they approach full draw, the archer brings the arrow and bowstring into alignment with the forearm. This allows him or her to rely less on active muscle exertion and more on the passive support of the skeletal system. At that point, with alignment achieved and the angle of the bowstring becoming more and more acute, the index finger can be relaxed, saving it from unnecessary discomfort and awkwardness, both when holding and upon release. We do not know with any certainty if this method was actually used by any of the diverse and widespread Slavic peoples. The manuals use the term sakaliba. This is a somewhat nebulous term that could possibly refer to several Eastern European populations, but it could also refer more specifically to military slaves or mercenaries of European origin. That said, perhaps there could be some truth to the Slavic connection. Roman sources suggest that, much like most Northern Europeans, the early Slavic tribes used simple self-bows. For example, the Strategicon and Tactica relate the legendary origin of these peoples to the north of the Danube, and that they used wooden bows. The usual method of release with such equipment is some form of fingers draw. This is true the world over, including in Europe, so it does not stretch credulity that the Mediterranean draw would have been the ancestral technique of these peoples. But upon migrating further south, or upon being turned into slave soldiers in Middle Eastern armies, they would have gained more exposure to compact Asiatic bows. At least some of them could very well have followed the example of the Bhutanese, and similarly modified their traditional shooting technique to compensate for the sharper string angle of the new equipment. Regardless of exact ethnic background, interaction between Middle Easterners and Europeans used to longer self bows would have naturally bred the circumstances under which the so called Slavic draw could have been advantageous. So it is not surprising that we learn about this method from Middle Eastern sources. The Slavs themselves left no records of this method, and medieval murals from Europe seem to suggest the persistence of more standard varieties of the Mediterranean draw. But in the absence of other evidence, we have no other choice but to seek out the truth by analogy. The Bhutanese have come up with a similar unusual release completely independent of the Sakaliba, and they have performed this adaptation under what appear to be very similar circumstances. It is a fantastic example of convergent evolution of technique, and their rationale appears to be the simplest and most logical explanation for how and why this draw came into being, and why it might still have a place in the modern world.